I'm a Down syndrome man. I wanted to change that, the way people look at people with Down syndrome that are just like all of us.
I think this is a really important thing, Jason, that judgment, looking at the world and asking where can things be better and how can we affect change? How can we reshape people's imagination and help them lean into something that is more graceful and more true? This is a really important part of the kingdom of God. And so calling people to change in this situation, in lots of different situations in our life, being able to name this is wrong and it could be better, this is part of what it means to follow the way of God. Judgment, in that sense, does not mean we don't ever get to say, hey, that's wrong. We don't ever get to say this should change. What it means is we don't write off people because of their mistakes. And so even the way that you're talking about this, I want to change people's perception. I want to show them that there's more to you and to other people than they thought there was. That is a form of judgment because you're correcting and you're helping them. But even in that statement, you are leaning into those relationships, helping them become better and helping them change. That is a really healthy, good way of doing judgment in the world because we're moving each other forward. You're not discarding those people, even if perhaps they've done that to you a little bit. So thank you for that. Bobby, you want anything?
I would just say we're really, really, you are a gift to us, Jason. You're a gift to the 7pm community, and you are a gift to everyone who gets to encounter you out in the world. So we're really glad that you lend your voice here. It's wise.
Absolutely.
This text seems really hard to interpret. And is this an ancient writing thing? Is this a Greek to English thing? Why can't it be clear the way you just preached it?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything particularly troubling in the translation. So all the difficulty that we're seeing here is in the story as it comes to us. There's no quick fix to it. And I think that is part of Jesus' intent in using parable, that he is not trying to give us simplistic answers. He's trying to ask us to wrestle with questions and to say, okay, what do we understand about God? What do we understand about how God is revealed in the person of Jesus, and how he lives his life and what he's willing to give his life for? And then how do we go back to those stories and dig into them and sit with them and wrestle with them and sometimes even come up with different interpretations as we go. I've read parables and come back to them years later, found new ideas and new convictions in there. But I think what's important about this one is all through, lots of different interpretations of this parable. There's always been a thread throughout Christian history of saying we can't map the violence of this story onto the way that God discards human beings in the world. God's wrath, God's judgment is directed at the godlessness and wickedness of humanity, as Paul says it. So what are those objects of wrath and frustration? What are they representing? I think the most faithful way to interpret that is those objects represent all the things that need to go so that God can extend grace and welcome to all of us. And again, we have to step back. It's a parable, right? It's not a one-to-one able to map onto the world. But if we're the vineyard, all of us, including those of us who misunderstand God, what is it that stands in the way and stops God from coming to us? Sometimes it's ideas, sometimes it's religion, sometimes it's stories that have been imposed on us, and all of that needs to be pushed out of the way so that Jesus can bring us home. It's a tough story, but I think that's part of the fun of it sometimes. What do you want to add?
Yes, Pete, I feel you on this question. It is like reading it, you kind of run into a bit of a wall. And I had sort of three responses, which I'll map out quickly. One is, I need a little more time with this one. And I think that's really like a normal thing to encounter these texts and just give yourself some space. Like, I'm just going to need a little more time with that. The second thing I was thinking about is that, isn't it interesting that even our violence makes its way into the stories of Jesus? That to sort of flip it, like there's nothing our own violence doesn't touch, and that somehow in these wild, hard to hold on to stories, Jesus is even addressing our violence. And the third thing I like to kind of wonder about when I'm struggling or like running into a bit of a wall with texts, it's like, what is this like? What is this kind of storytelling like? And I want to think a little bit more about this storytelling in this parable like a horror movie, maybe because it's October. But I think that there are these ways that horrific things get portrayed to actually subvert some really like powerful structures in the world that tend to leave people out. So people who love monsters and love horror films, they're playing with ideas about power, they're playing with ideas about how far we can push human psychology. There's so much, and I think I want to do some more thinking about these stories being shocking, like for a pretty subversive and like turn it on its head kind of way. So I feel like that's such a normal response to be like, oh, this, even after hearing a really great, powerful, beautiful sermon, to still read the text and be like, but what do I do with this? I feel that, and give yourself some space to map it out in your own imagination while holding something really helpful that was offered to us today.
Before we go tonight, I'll mention this, because I had this in my notes and I had to cut it for time tonight. But one of the interpretations of this parable over the years has been, well, the wicked tenants are the Jewish people, and God is going to wipe them out, and he's going to hand the vineyard to the Gentiles. And that is an incredibly supersessionist is the technical term we would use, but it's an anti-Semitic view of God's grace in the world. And that's actually specifically what Ambrose was addressing in the 300s when he wrote that passage I was talking about. He's saying, no, we can't just say, well, the Jewish people are bad, and therefore we get their place. He's saying, no, God is extending grace to all of us. And so we have to read a little bit harder. We have to push a little bit deeper, because our instinct is going to be, well, who don't we like? Who are our enemies? They must be the bad guys in the story. And Ambrose is saying, I think we need to wrestle with this more. And then he has that beautiful phrase where he says, the people of God are correctly named as the vineyard. All of us are the vineyard. Okay, well then how do we reinterpret the story? But that's specifically what he's pushing against, because that has been a counter-strain throughout church history that I think is incredibly problematic, and I think feeds into some of the things that Bobby was talking about as well. It's very easy for us to put our enemy in those places and to find those stories that are going to justify what we want in the world. That's never going to be good for us.